I think it's important that we continue to keep looking for those shining moments of triumph. And then also support one another. We're stronger together. We're going to get a lot more into community today, and I already feel like we have such a strong community, and so let's celebrate that and support each other. And you will notice the logo is a tiger, and that's not on accident. And you'll see in your programs that we chose a tiger because tigers are known to take down predators much larger than themselves. And I know that human trafficking feels like that. I hear from people a lot of times like, well, we're never going to solve it. It's too big. It's been around too long. That's not true. We can do something about that, and we're going to be like tigers. Now we're going to get into the program. We have somebody very exciting joining us today. I don't see her. I know she's here. Alhena, raise your hand. Oh, she's over there. All right. Alhena Herrera Martin is joining us today. She's the Labor Trafficking Specialist with the Trafficking Response and Intervention Program, which we call the T.R.I.P Team, from the Oregon Department of Justice Crime Victim and Survivor Services Division. And I heard about Alhena from Rosa. And then I kept hearing more about Alhena, and then more about Alhena, and the incredible things that she's doing here in the state of Oregon to combat and educate our communities on labor trafficking. I do want to mention that you guys might not think that labor trafficking happens here, but I was at a conference in Wyoming, and I slipped into a session, and there was a video playing on the screen. A guy was doing an expose, or he was doing a session on gang trafficking. And they were showing this expose from ABC News about labor trafficking. And I'm sitting in the back of the room watching this horrendous story on labor trafficking. And then they zoom out, and it's the Rogue Valley. It was Southern Oregon. And I'm like, that's my home. And I had no idea it was happening at this level here. And this was last year. So we're really lucky to have you, Alhena, and your expertise. So let's give Alhena a warm welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We're going to be doing things a bit unorthodox this morning. I know it's bright and early, so I'm hoping the coffee has kicked in. So if you can all take out your cell phones. Thank you. Well, we're actually going to be starting with, we're going to be confiscating all your identifying documentation. And because we also are going to be limiting who you have contact and access to. So we're going to be confiscating those cell phones you took out, any mobile devices, as well as any forms of communication. And then we're going to be splitting into 3 groups. The first group, the folks right here, you're going to be staying here at the hotel. You're going to be providing services and assisting them, providing their housekeeping, their laundry, their services. The second group, you're the real lucky ones right here. You get to go with the organizers and presenters of the summit. You're going to be attending to their domestic work, their housekeeping, the laundry, their childcare, trimming their trees, cutting their grass, and any other job they seem necessary. The third group, you're the real lucky ones because you get to leave the country. You're going to be transported to a country so you can produce cheap goods. One thing is true for all of you. You'll be working long hours with very to minimal pay, maybe sometimes no pay. But because we're nice, we're also going to be providing you with basic needs. But that's going to cost you. And you'll have a debt that will be impossible to pay off. And if you try to contact law enforcement, an agency, or make a report, you'll be faced with threats and violence. Threats against your families, yourself, your community members. Let that sink in. You're forced to work against your will. Where if you try to seek help, you see threats and violence. Where you have mandatory overtime. Where if you are one of the lucky people and are in another country, you may know another language, the customs, the traditions, or who you can ask for help. My name is Alhena Herrera Martin, and I'm the Labor Trafficking Specialist with the Oregon Department of Justice, and I am really excited to be here, and I'm really excited you're all here, and I just want to thank Lauren and the organizers for shedding light in labor trafficking here in Oregon. Before we dive in, so let me find my clicker, but before we dive in, as with any government agency, there's always that disclaimer. So I am bound to tell you that this presentation was created with funding from the Office of Victims of Crime or OVC. My personal disclaimer is to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. These topics are really hard to talk about and even harder to understand that they're happening right in your backyard. So get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. But before we dive in, this presentation is interactive. So I hope you all can engage with me this morning. On the screen, you'll see a QR code as well as a website. Those cell phones that I asked you to take out earlier, I'm not going to confiscate them. They're actually for you to scan the QR code. If you're in a position where you can't scan, if you go to the website www.menti.com, it'll ask you for an access code or presentation code. It is 44592082. There's also a QR code right on this water section here if you need to scan it. But the presentation will ask you to submit true and false questions just for you to kind of engage with me this morning. So before we get started on our journey, let's do a practice test. Yesterday we talked about, one of the presenters talked about self-care and things that you should do for yourself. So on your screen, you should start seeing options, which we'll see live results here. So I want to know what you did for self-care. I can tell you that thanks to Rosa's mom and her recommendations, I ended up on a nature walk in your beautiful Lithium Park. So you're very lucky to have that park here. So thank you for engaging with me. But now as we embark on our journey to understand and explore more about labor trafficking, now I do want to know true and false. Labor trafficking only happens in developing countries. What do you folks think? You were listening yesterday, thank you. So yes, labor trafficking, although it does happen in developing countries, it also happens here, in the United States, nationwide, and here in Oregon as well. Although labor trafficking is identified and reported at very lower rates. So yesterday, you saw or heard Rebecca talking about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is the federal definition that defines what trafficking is, as well as some protections for victims. On the screen, you should see some of the protections from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was initially passed and reauthorized year by year. And every year, a new form or a new clarification goes in. But for labor trafficking, the TVPA defines labor trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. That's a long legal word, and I don't know about you, but I am not an attorney. So what does it actually mean? Oops. Oh no, give me one moment. It'll be helpful if I could click the right screens, right? So labor trafficking is actually an action by means of force for the purpose of exploitation. So that means that for a situation of labor trafficking to be potentially identified, we need an action, a means, and a purpose. That means that for an adult victim or a minor victim, a trafficker or traffickers must take an action, the recruitment, transportation, harboring, receiving, and then employ a means of force, fraud, and coercion, the abduction, threat, deceit, and abuse of power and power and control, for the purpose of an exploitation, forced labor, involuntary servitude, debt bondage, peonage, slavery. What services was the victim made to perform? So again, labor trafficking is the action, means, and purpose. Although it does need all of these elements, all it needs is one element from each column to potentially identify a situation of labor trafficking. One thing to note is that labor trafficking has all the elements of labor exploitation, right? We see in some situations wage theft, child labor. We also see very poor working conditions, labor law violations like harassment, discrimination, mandatory overtime, but it's the presence of force, fraud, and coercion that indicates that a victim is not consenting to their own free will. The presence of force, fraud, and coercion is what differentiates labor trafficking from labor exploitation. But what is force, fraud, and coercion? We see these terms kind of thrown around. Well, let's break it down. Force, fraud, and coercion can take many forms, from the physical to mental abuse, verbal intimidation, threats of force, or even the threat of legal action. Force uses the physical control, and we see that with physical violence, physical restrictions, sexual assaults, forced or controlled substance abuse, isolation, kidnapping, restrictions, or controlling the person's access to food, who they can speak with, or just basic necessities. Fraud uses a form of deception, right? We usually see that with false promises, false job offers, or a misrepresentation of working or living conditions. We see that with fraudulent visa schemes, or in individuals getting their wages withheld. Coercion, however, is not as tangible as force, fraud, or coercion. And it's usually not often, and it's usually under-identified as a form of exploitation. It uses a psychological form. It's a state of fear. And we see that usually with verbal abuse, debt bondage, the withholding of legal documents. We also see that with threats against the victim, their family, threats of deportation, getting the police involved, whether that's local or federal, or reputational harm. Think back at the beginning, the group that you might have even felt shame for being deceited, thinking you were all coming to a summit, but in reality, you were about to get exploited. Psychological harm is part of coercion. In fact, the definition of coercion means threats of harm to or physical restraint against any person, any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act will result in serious harm to or physical restraint against any person or the abuse or threatened abuse of legal action. Okay, so we learned what the AMP and force, fraud, and coercion is. So if you can see on your phones, this trafficking requires movement. Okay, so labor trafficking victims are usually foreign national or immigrants from other countries. Thank you for engaging with me this morning. Well, as you're all right, anyone can be a victim of labor trafficking, including US citizens, undocumented individuals, and foreign nationals. Actually, a lot of foreign nationals have their visa tied to a specific employer or to a person. However, there are certain populations, although they're at higher risk, it is the individuals, as we've learned yesterday, the individual's vulnerability that makes an individual more susceptible to trafficking. Although there's no standard profile for what a labor trafficking is, or what a labor trafficking victim looks like, there are certain vulnerabilities and risk factors that make an individual more susceptible. But actually, what are those vulnerabilities? Traffickers, as we've learned, often target vulnerabilities. And they can encompass a wide range of situations, and that includes any risk factors that are individual, relationship, community, or societal. Individual risk factors can include disabilities, discrimination or stigmas, limited or lack of transportation or access to language or educational opportunities, a history of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or children and youth that are experiencing adverse childhood experiences, and especially youth or minors that are unaccompanied. There might be homelessness, a runaway or stable housing situations. There might be undocumented, unstable immigration statuses, or forced migration. There might also be members of marginalized or disadvantaged communities, like children and youth, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or members of the LGBTQ community, or individuals involved in systems, whether that's foster care, the juvenile or criminal justice process, or even immigration. Relationship risk factors increases an individual's vulnerabilities. They usually include an adult's or youth or child's family members, their social circles, their mentors, people that surround them. And that can increase the ability for them to experience family violence, social isolation, familial poverty, familial trafficking, as we've learned yesterday, forced migration, a lack of support system, family conflict disruption or dysfunction, or even an intolerance of gender identity and sexual orientation can all increase a person's vulnerability. Community risk factors are natural disasters, right? Every summer we have a fire, there's always fires, that can displace people. We also have a lack of workers' rights knowledge, community violence, disparities among groups, limited knowledge, awareness, or training. Look around the room. How many of you are here versus how many live in your community that are talking about labor trafficking? There might be jurisdictional issues between tribal and local agencies that can put Indigenous people in harm or at risk for labor trafficking. There might be underserved schools, neighborhood, or communities. There might also be a loss of land, culture, language, and identity, specifically for marginalized, Indigenous, and tribal communities. In addition, remote or tribal communities may not have access or the ability to connect with organizations or experts that can identify or even assist or support a survivor. Societal risk factors are usually large risk factors. Those that include a lack of resources, disparity between communities, gender-based violence, systemic oppression, health and economic disparities, cultural attitudes towards marginalized individuals or groups, a demand for cheap goods. How many of us are always trying to find for the lowest price on something? Patterns that reinforce the perfect victim or the ideal victim biases. There's also social factors like policies that can cause economic, educational, and health or inequalities between groups, the haves and have-nots. One thing is true, though. It is important to remember that the absence of any of these risk factors, whether it's individual, relationship, community, or societal, does not mean that an individual or a group of people are not being trafficked. So true and false. Labor trafficking only happens in illegal industries. We have a smart group this morning. Okay, so I want you to think. What industries does labor trafficking actually happen? Think about the industries within your communities. What are they? What job opportunities do you usually see? In your phones, you should see an option to write, what industries are in your community? I want to know. Do you see hotels? Agriculture? Convenience stores? Indigenous communities? Marginalized groups? Massage parlors? Cleaning services? Fishing? Strip clubs? And the issue gets bigger and bigger as you start thinking about what industries there are, right? Well, the truth is, no, you're all correct. Labor trafficking can happen in any of these industries, right? We have your construction, your landscaping, forestry, lodging, individuals forced to panhandle, grocery stores, retail stores. The person that's checking you out at the cash register, they might not be getting paid for that work. It is also important to note that some of these industries will have an intersection with sex trafficking. They'll have a labor trafficking survivor being exploited by day, and then sexually trafficked at night, and vice versa. We might also see, as we see here in Oregon, illegal marijuana grows, childcare, nanny services, foods and restaurants, massage parlors, as some of you mentioned, domestic work, recreational facilities, bars, strip clubs, foster care, group homes. We might even see assisted living. Who's taking care of the folks there? Your CNAs, your medical staffs. We might also see it in the food and restaurant services, recreational facilities. Who also served your food yesterday? So we've learned what the vulnerabilities, risk factors, as well as some of the what action means and purposes are. So let's break it down and let's talk about Patty. Patty is a 34-year-old female who migrated from Texas to Oregon and accepted a job at a marijuana grow farm, given her years of experience in agriculture. Her employer threatened her with physical violence and carries a gun after 2 days on the job. They restrict her from leaving the job site. They force her to work 16-hour days for a month. They threaten her with deportation. They restrict communication with her family. They control access to her basic needs. Her employer houses her in a room with 20 other workers that have not been paid for their labor. So what do we see here? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the risk factors? Well, she recently migrated. She has an undocumented status. There's physical violence, restrictions, wage theft, threats. And I want to highlight that this example is actually from here in Southern Oregon at an illegal marijuana grow. Let's meet River. River is a 19-year-old who received a contract that showed they would be employed as a nanny working 40 hours a week. After moving in with her employer, the victim is forced to work 14-hour days without overtime pay. Then, they are not confiscated for their cooking and housekeeping duties that are also assigned. Additionally, the victim is sexually assaulted and not allowed to leave the home. What do we see here? What are the vulnerabilities and risk factors? Well, we know that River had a misrepresentation of the job duties. They are also physically and sexually assaulted. They see restrictions and wage theft. And this can also happen in your community. How many live-in nannies aren't they? Or they might be isolated if they're living in rural communities, right? And you might just see them, oh, it's just a nanny taking care, or it's just a babysitter that I have for the night, without realizing that they might not even be paid for their work. Lastly, we have Jaden, 17-year-old runaway who joins a traveling sales crew. The employer confiscates his documents and belongings. They force them to work 7 days a week. They tell the youth that they are in the debt for the room and food that they'll be deducted from their wages. The youth is never in control of their wages, and when the youth complains, the employee is verbally and physically abusive. The youth is isolated from any support systems and threatened to call the police. If they run away, there's a vulnerability. What's happening in the home that made them run away? They're also a youth, usually more susceptible to trafficking. There's threats, physical violence, and verbal abuse. And if they are traveling, they might not have any roots or connection to their community. Given the complexities of labor trafficking, it is very hard to identify or sometimes having a victim seek help. There are a multitude of barriers that play a role in the identification of labor trafficking victims, as well as their ability to even connect with the community or connect to resources. They include physical violence, starvation, right? We've learned that sometimes they'll be limited to some of their food or basic needs. There might be forced drug use or criminality. Think shoplifting. What about identity theft, card theft, right? It criminalizes the individual. You might even see like, oh, they're buying drugs, but maybe that trafficker is forcing them so they don't get involved. There might be also an intersection with sex trafficking, right? I spoke earlier about an individual, could be a sales cashier. They might be exploited, work 16-hour days, and then be sexually sex trafficked by night. There might be sexual abuse and trauma, serious injury, and illnesses. Illnesses that might, the body usually keeps score, or if they're doing very hard labor or repetitive labor, they might see those illnesses. There might be psychological trauma. Victims often have experienced a psychological coercion, right? We learned what coercion means. So they have a variety of reasons, and valid reasons, to mistrust law enforcement agencies, as well as organizations or individuals. There is that fear of mistrust. There might be shame or stigmatization, right? We talked about earlier. If you were deceived thinking you were coming to a training, but in reality, you were going to be forced to work, you might feel shame. There might be pressure from their families, whether it's for undocumented individuals or individuals that have certain vulnerabilities. They might feel that pressure that I need to support my family. There might also be language barriers for the folks that were going to be sent to another country. What if you didn't speak the language? There might be a dependence on the trafficker. Their trafficker is providing a need. There might also be bias and discrimination towards communities vulnerable to trafficking. Barriers can also include a lack of appropriate victim-centered or survivor-led screening practices. There's also a lack of understanding or knowledge on what our state's sanctuary law, right? We're a sanctuary state. But a lot of folks don't know or don't have the awareness to know how that can actually benefit an individual, to know what type of benefits they may be applied to or what the limitations are. There might also be a lack of resources to respond and investigate, a lack of labor trafficking knowledge. Labor trafficking has been happening for a long time, but it is now coming to the surface. I've been doing this work for a little bit over half a decade, but I've been working with labor trafficking victims this whole time. Knowledge of victims' rights or systems navigations. How many of you know how to navigate certain systems? When you're applying for certain benefits or you want to retire and you're looking at your 401k, do you even know how to navigate those without any support? It's the same process, same fallacy. And there might also be power and control dynamics that come into play, that this makes labor trafficking very difficult to identify. That's why it's important that from the very first disclosure or interaction with the labor trafficking victim, a positive interaction is very, very important. And that is, it kind of paves the way for the survivor's journey. Because they might be experiencing emergent or urgent needs if they're trying to escape that situation. They may need help with safety planning, basic foods, right? The trafficker has been providing most of the basic necessities, where they're staying, where they're living, where they're eating. There might be a language access. They may be coming from a remote area that they speak an indigenous language from their home country. They might not even just general English or other languages that are more popular. They might also need intensive case management, emergency or medical necessities. They might even need a phone to contact their family members. They may also need immigration assistance, community and other system-based advocacy. Additionally, once the urgent needs are met, they'll need transitional needs, like transitional housing, safety planning for any additional concerns. If they have children, they might need childcare, primary care assistance, mental health support, legal assessments, English as a second language education, or education to what their victim rights are, especially if they're going through certain systems, if they're going to court to testify, if they're going to be helping out with the investigation and the detective. They may also need substance abuse treatment and support. and other opportunities specifically for communities and tribal and other cultural specific support, connecting them to people that they may feel more comfortable with. I always say representation matters, and it's very true, specifically for labor trafficking victims or any victim for that matter. They might also need long-term support and healing, right? They can't stay at the transitional housing forever. They're gonna need permanent housing, additional safety planning if they have any additional safety concerns. We talked about how the body keeps score, so they might need medical access for any ongoing support or treatment. What if they develop carpal tunnel during their exploitation? They might need group support and mentoring services, civil legal support. What if the trafficker is the father of the child? Now we have a civil issue. They might need that support. Educational services. If they're an unaccompanied minor, a runaway, or youth, they might need reunification to family. They might also need employment services, financial support, and community and tribal connection, right? If we find a victim of labor trafficking somewhere in Montana, but they're originally from Ashland, they're gonna need that community connection again to feel supported. Trafficking is a community problem. No individual, no organization can effectively address labor trafficking alone. It takes a community effort. These cases take a multitude of resources to empower and support a victim. We saw a lot of the needs that they're gonna need. We're gonna need to build rapport with them. They've been deceived, they've been physically assaulted, they might not trust. It is important to build a foundation of partnerships, and that is essential in building support. In the greatest words of Coretta Scott, the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. All of you. What actions? It is important to know that every individual plays a role in helping labor trafficking victims. You are all pieces of the puzzle, right? We are gonna need partnerships between law enforcement, agencies, local communities, grassroots and cultural specific organizations, local and state agencies, immigration and civil attorneys, community-based advocates and system-based advocates. Being able to bring all these pieces together, all these people to the table, that are going to focus on the survivor's needs, that will have lasting impacts on the survivor and their pathway to healing and support. Every individual who has experienced trafficking will have a very unique need and will require a different mix of services. It will need to be collaborative, victim-centered, and multidisciplinary approach to collectively cooperate, coordinate, and collaborate services to support the survivor of labor trafficking. If you're working for an organization and then target outreach of what your organization is not providing, and build those partnerships. So I just want to take a look at this picture. All these systems, think about your social circles, who you can connect to, where do you work? All of these will take a community effort. So what can we do, right? Well, first of all, you're all here, so that is the very first step, showing up. But when you show up, you show up. Using available tools. There's actually in the website framework, they have the labor trafficking outreach fundamental workbooks. And it provides a framework of how to build those partnerships. You can also get started with tracking what are your connections? Who are you connecting with? And updating and see what's missing. Are you connecting with local agencies, tribal communities? What about grassroots or cultural specific organizations? So when you encounter a victim, you know who to contact. Who provides transitional housing, urgent needs. You can also, if you do suspect labor trafficking is happening, you can report it to your local police stations, or you can also call the national hotline. If you work for a school organization, you can also implement trauma-informed practices. If you're a teacher, administrator, you can create a human trafficking school safety protocol. If you work for a hospital or emergency room, or you're in the medical field, substance abuse clinic, mental health center, what about learning the core competencies of human trafficking response in the healthcare and behavioral systems? Are you an attorney, or do you know an attorney? What about getting them to provide pro bono services to labor trafficking victims? You can also become a mentor to a young person or someone in need. Think about the vulnerabilities. Think about the people that you see in your everyday lives that may need that support. We need that collectively support for them. And as a community, you can all provide a support to a local victim service providers. Look at the agencies around you. Look at the agencies that are also missing from this conversation. You can also learn more about our sanctuary laws. You could also, while learning for our state sanctuary laws, learn how they play a vital role with your law enforcement. You can also connect to local organizations. Ask how you can help. They might need volunteers. And my experience working for a nonprofit, there's always something to do, and there's always a need for volunteers. You can increase your knowledge on labor trafficking. This just scrapes the surface, and we can go in every which way to explore even further. You could build partnerships and bridges. If you know somebody's having a vulnerability, what can you do to connect them to services? What can you do to feel welcome in the community? If it's a runaway or youth, what can you do to make them feel supported or seen? If in your social circles, there might be a stigma for members of marginalized communities or members of the LGBTQ community, what can you do to start those conversations within your communities to increase that ability to have different perceptions or at least be able to support an individual? Tap your skills and networks. Organize a fundraiser. You get connected with your community, you get to see who's in your community, but then donate those funds to your service providers, the ones that are on the ground providing services. You can also connect to professionals, advocates, and those that are providing those services and learn from them. What are their experiences? What can you do to support them so they can provide the services they need? If you're in administration, what are you doing to support your staff to making sure that they have enough capacity and are not burning out? As we come to the conclusion of our journey to explore labor trafficking, I urge you to take one more moment to take those cell phones, and you can scan this QR code. It is also at the table on the entrance to learn more about labor trafficking. It has resources. It also has a link to the outreach workbook that I was speaking about, and it also has information about sanctuary laws and just different information to learn more and explore further of labor trafficking. Finally, I challenge you to think about the actions and steps you can do to build partnerships in your communities, address labor trafficking, whether it's spreading awareness, volunteering at your local agencies, advocating for victims' rights, understanding workers' rights, starting a conversation in your communities with your family members and your friends. Thank you for your time and attention and engaging me today. And I'm very, very glad that you're all here today. And I hope that you continue to spread awareness and start the conversation on what is labor trafficking. Thank you.